And there are some super fun, oh, look at you giving us doctor titles. I mean,
I know.
we are technically doctors. So just seeing Dr. Amy always makes me think I'm like a late night weird, like, call in with your weird relationship and sex problems host.
Hey.
But okay.
You would do so great at hosting a show like that, I just have to say.
Well, if academia falls through, it's good to know I have a backup plan. Okay, so week 2. We'll talk about the actual agenda for week 2 in a second, but I just had a couple quick announcements, and then Ellen's going to be taking lead for the beginning bit here. So I apologize for not having them up sooner. I just wanted to let folks know transcripts are available now on the website on week 1. It took me a little bit of time to go through and edit the transcript because I use my time poorly mostly. So transcripts are now available. I will try and get those up quicker in the future for videos. I might experiment with trying to actually make the closed caption on the YouTube video. That's a step I've never done before, so I will work on that, but there is a transcript available. And then if you have any content you want to share with the group, there's been some really wonderful conversations, especially on Discord, happening with people talking about how they grade or don't grade, or frame grading, frame assessment. We're going to talk about assessment this week, but I just kind of wanted to let people know if you have any cool stuff. We have a Google form set up that you can submit things, or you can just email it to me, and it's delightful. There's been really cool conversations, and I am definitely seeing a lot of things that I plan to steal for future classes of mine. That's, I think, it for announcements. Ellen, all you.
Oh, now it's me. How exciting. So today, because a big part of what we're talking about is goals and objectives, we need to start out by talking about goals and objectives. So we're trying to model those pedagogical models, those pedagogical stuff we're talking about as best we can. So today we're going to, by the end of the session, you will be able to define terms like backward course design, Bloom's taxonomy, student-centered learning and student-centered course design, formative and summative assessment, authentic assessment. Basically, feel free at any point when you have questions about stuff like this, if they're especially about definitional terms that you want us to talk a little bit about more, feel free to type into the chat. Amy and I will be kind of monitoring it as we're talking. And the main goals for today, the main things we're going to work on are articulating learning objectives for your classes, and creating assessments that align with those learning objectives. How exactly we do that is basically, we're going to split this up into kind of 2 tasks, and one of them is going to be talking about learning objectives, and the other that Amy's going to take over is going to be talking about assessments. But really, the way we're wanting to think about them is how these things work together. And the main way we want to kind of talk about that is in terms of backward course design. So for those of you who haven't come across this term before, basically the whole idea of backward course design is that we are starting with the end in mind, right? We start thinking about what we want our students to achieve by the end of a course and working our way backward. Instead of starting with content or starting with structure or something like that. And basically this kind of, this basic idea I'm sure has existed for a long time. The way it's articulated in this form of backward course design comes from this book as Understanding by Design. And they basically frame it as our lessons, units, and courses should be logically inferred from the results sought, not derived from the methods, books, and activities with which we're most comfortable. Curriculum should lay out the most effective ways of achieving specific results. The best designs derive backward from the learning sought. So a visual way to kind of think about this is something like this. So in standard course planning, the way I was certainly taught to plan a course originally, right? You choose a textbook or you choose readings, and then you make your syllabus based on those readings, right? I think the first question we ask anybody is like, I'm teaching a class on epic, right? Oh, what are you going to read? What text are you going to read, right? Is the first question, rather than what do you want students to get out of the class, right? So here, and then we kind of go in this order, right? We make the syllabus. Usually the syllabus is kind of a schedule more than kind of a laying out the theory of the class or what we want students to achieve. You write and revise lectures, you make notes, you prepare PowerPoints, you design homework assignments, and exams and things like that, right? All in this kind of model of starting from my perspective as the instructor, what I want to cover, right? As opposed to backward design, which is much more student-centered, right? Thinking about what we want students to achieve. So what learning goals do we want our students to have? What do we want students to get out of the class at the end? And then kind of work backwards, right? For thinking about broad learning goals, then kind of getting more specific, setting specific learning objectives for students, and figuring out ways to frame those in ways that are clear. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about in a minute. And then designing assignments, formative and summative assessments, which Amy's going to talk about more later. And then kind of preparing learning activities, right? Thinking about the structure of the course, right? Do you want to have lectures? Do you want to have it to be a discussion-based class? All dependent on what you want to set those learning objectives for in the first place, right? And this is the reason we call it it's more student-centered, because we're thinking more about what students are doing and what they're achieving. We're framing the class around what students are, how students are encountering it, rather than what the instructor is doing. So it's more about what the students are doing, what they're achieving, and how they're working on skills, and what they're learning, than about content distribution, which I feel like is the way that the instructor-centered model often works. I am not looking at the chat right now. Amy, are you going to tell me if anybody brings anything up that is like questions? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Yes, I will do that.
Okay.
People are sharing resources and whatnot, and running commentary, but you're good. I will, if we need an interruption, I will interrupt.
Yeah. And there is stuff about this, by the way. There's more stuff shared in the, on the website, as well as in the notes for the slideshow. If you look at the kind of presenter notes section, there are some links and stuff like that. Okay. So the first thing we want to talk about in terms of backward design is learning objectives, because this is kind of the first thing you do. So our goal is to set these learning objectives. Some people will call them learning goals. Some people will call them learning outcomes. I feel like calling them outcomes is a little presumptuous, like I already know exactly what's going to happen, which I feel like I don't. So I usually call them objectives or goals. And we want to make sure that we're setting learning objectives that are clear and specific, that are measurable, and that are student-centered, right? So we already talked about that student-centeredness of them. What skills and knowledge do we want students to develop and demonstrate in the class, right? This is not about the content that the knowledge I want to kind of distribute from my side, but what do I want them to work on? What do I want them to develop? Them being measurable is how we get at that assessment question, right? Which is what Amy is going to talk about later. Them being clear and specific is how we kind of demonstrate, how we show our students that this is what they're going to do. So how can you articulate these objectives in a way that clearly indicates to students what they're going to achieve in the course? And one of the major ways we can kind of think about this is looking at Bloom's taxonomy, which is basically, as you can see, kind of a hierarchical structure of different sorts of cognitive tasks. So it's set up in this pyramid because we can think of kind of lower level tasks that aren't, as opposed to kind of higher order and kind of working your way up in a hierarchy, as it were. So I tend to think about this more about curriculum-wide hierarchy, right? So we might want those lower level tasks, remembering tasks, understanding tasks, to be more appropriate for lower level courses, right? Your 101, your 102, your first year level courses. Whereas students who are in upper level courses certainly need to be able to do those analyze, evaluate, create tasks. So if we're thinking about kind of student curriculum along a growth paradigm, right? But we can also think about it over the course of a semester, right? Over the course of a class. Students kind of evolving from more tasks that are on the kind of lower end of the hierarchy to upper end. And this hierarchy, by the way, doesn't necessarily, like, it's not a judgment value necessarily. Like, there are ways in which we need students to, upper level students also need to be able to recall facts and basic concepts. But we want them to go beyond that as well, right? It's not just regurgitation. And this is kind of the thing that I like about Bloom's taxonomy, is that it gives us a way to think about how to develop these skills over time.
Can I jump in for just a quick, Stephanie Craven has raised her hand. I just wanted to give her a second to jump in before we move on.
Yeah, so on the files, I sent everybody a handout that we give to students at the Learning Center where I work.
Yay.
A version of Bloom's taxonomy. One of the things that I found really useful, and unfortunately I can't find the picture, but I did actually take the word, Xenia, and work it through on my whiteboard, how it would go with each level of, Bloom's taxonomy, and what kinds of levels you would integrate as you go to each one. I had done some reading on this, and basically what they're saying is, in American education for the last 30 years, there's been the assumption that you're going to have people doing more memorization at the lower levels and that you can't create until you get to the upper levels. And it's really kind of not true. Like, it is a little bit about integrating. Like, you have to be aware that as Ellen was saying, yes, the students at the upper levels have to be able to remember things, but a lot of the times you learn to remember things because you sat and you've worked through the different nuances of something. So yeah, but the handout I send is kind of a good way to practice. And if I need to find it, because I've actually seen there's a wonderful list of, this one has a little bit, but there's a wonderful list of like different words and how they fit into the taxonomy. So when you're asking different types of questions, you can see like, oh, perfect.
Like this? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Next slide.
Right.
And there's a link for this PDF, by the way, in the notes at the bottom. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Stephanie.
Oh yeah, I mean, that was kind of the big thing, that it's kind of got to go back and forth, that, sometimes it's remembering, like sometimes it's like, okay, acunde, ex and pro sine sub, but also, have that in line with, what do I know is going on with an ablative and what's it telling me in a sentence. And so, having those things mesh together. And so I think there are ways that you can do creative activities at a lower level, but you have to kind of make sure that you've sort of limited the toolkit a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good observation, right? It's not that, I like the hierarchy in a lot of ways. I feel like it helps us to think about what's appropriate at different levels. But as you're pointing out, there are no fast rules about the way a particular class has to work, right? Like, I asked my students in Latin 101 to do creative projects still, because I do want them to be working with the language, right? I don't want them just to be regurgitating information. And I don't feel like at the college level, I never expect that of any class, right? For students to be just kind of working on recalling facts and terms, right? And I think that a lot of our secondary educators would probably say the same thing for them too, right? So the thing I wanted to bring up, we can think about it both in this term, in terms of the hierarchy, right, with this pyramid, but also we have a kind of alignment like this where we can think about the taxonomy and just kind of how to divide up the different types of tasks that you ask students to do. And I like this kind of format in terms of thinking about how to frame action, or how to frame learning objectives in terms of action verbs, right? What we expect students to do. In a lot of ways, it almost feels like writing a resume for what you're expecting students to be able to achieve by the end of the class. Let's use our different action verbs. But in a lot of ways, I feel like it helps to really articulate what it is that you're trying to ask them to do. So to get back to backwards design and how this kind of fits within the framework of backwards design, basically the stage, what we're doing is, in thinking about learning objectives, is planning stage 1, right? We're identifying the desired results of our course. What do we want our students to achieve? And then the second part, which we can think about in two separate stages, stage 2, determining acceptable evidence, is to align your assessments with those learning objectives, right? We say that we want our students to, I don't know, be able to build a cogent argument or something like that. How do we assess that? Well, maybe we have them write an argumentative essay as their final paper or something like that, right? So how can we best assess whether students have achieved these objectives successfully? Is the second question we have to ask. And then the last thing is thinking about general activities in the course, right? We're planning the learning experience, what the class, not just the assignments, but what the class is going to be like on a day-to-day basis. So what kind of learning experiences, readings, lectures, activities, assignments, basically everything else you do in a class that's not a final project or something, would best help students achieve these objectives. So we're going to start every time by thinking about that first thing. Let me go back. This stage 1, how do we identify those learning outcomes, those learning objectives, goals, whatever we want to, however we want to call them. And then Amy's going to talk a little bit about assessment and how we can think about that, especially in terms of online learning. But for our first breakout, basically we're going to be divided up into breakout groups using Zoom to its best capacity. If you have tech trouble or anything like that, be sure to just come back to the main room and we'll help you out. Don't forget to introduce yourselves, but basically our plan is to kind of try to workshop our classes. Pick one or more of your current or potential courses to workshop with your group, thinking about the following questions. What do you want your students to be able to do by the end of term? Maybe list 2 or 3 course level learning goals, objectives, something like that. And these can be in kind of broad terms, right? And then you can kind of think together, does anybody in your group share these goals or objectives? And then see if you can kind of workshop them together. How can you articulate them in a way that clearly indicates to students what they're going to achieve? And we can go back to using those, the Bloom's taxonomy kind of, you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted, before I split everybody into rooms.
Measurable, though we'll be talking more about assessment later.
Sorry, Ellen, either I or you have lost audio here. I'm not hearing you super clearly right now. So either I or you are having a bad connection. Okay, perfect. I think we're, yeah. So I'm going to split people up into breakout rooms, and I apologize if I'm talking over you, Ellen. For particularly, think about these questions in light of what might our learning objectives look like that are different in this, like there are things that I just can't expect my students to do that we would have normally done in person, and that's not a thing that we're going to do anymore. So, you know, and among this kind of general process, also think about ways that these things might look a little bit different than they have in person, because some of the things that you are expecting your students to be able to do, some of these outcomes might be different in this new and different environment, or as most of us are looking at right now, a hybrid environment. So some students will be in person and some students will not. Okay, have fun.